And what was the solution that you guys came up with for this fractured country that we call Lebanon?
Yeah, I can't say that we posed any solution necessarily. I mean, I think it was just, everyone's sort of looking at the same conclusion that it's the government structure with the division of power among the identified sects and based on strict numbers of allocation that related to the population at the time and haven't kept change with the population distribution. And obviously those who are in a majority position don't want to see their power base decrease. So obviously, you've seen the increase of largely the Shia community, decrease in Christian, and therefore, obviously, those who would lose power if they were to readjust the allocation of seats don't want to agree to anything. So you get this fixed system, and everyone trying to find ways external to the government to gain power, have their their leverage, and so again, the government always ends up fragile, weak, paralyzed, and then again, everyone spending years trying to come up with a new government. But no, look, it's a tough situation. I'm thankful it's not my responsibility to solve it. But as a journalist, I have certainly reported on the reality of it and how it how it plays out and how you end up with such frequent political crisis.
Wow. How would you define Hezbollah?
Dude. Yeah, exactly. I'll tell you, there was the first time I was in Beirut in 2007, and so I was interviewing a lot of political analysts and government officials and various people. And I can't remember who said it to me, but it was a great quote that I've adapted and used in other circumstances. But he said, "If you think you understand Lebanon, clearly no one has explained it to you."
That's true. That is literally the definition of Lebanon right there.
Yeah. So, I mean, one of my favorite places in the world, and disappointed I haven't been there since 2014 now, but have spent a fair amount of time over the years, and lots of friends, both expat and Lebanese, who have lived there over the years. So fascinating place, but it does get sad to see so many people stuck in a system that's not looking out for them.
Yeah,
I blame the people more than I blame the government. Yeah, because
think about that, Sean.
Okay, well, what's the fault of the people that you blame?
Well, you have to understand that in Lebanon, like my whole family's in the government. When I say my whole family's in the government, my whole family's in the government. Like the head of the whole country is from my family. Like he's the highest judge in Lebanon. But the problem is the people don't respect the law. And we're raised not to respect the law. And unfortunately.
Yeah. I mean, I've certainly seen lots of evidence of that in day-to-day life in the country. And I mean, look, it's something that sometimes people almost brag about. Right. It's, there's certain things about sort of the Lebanese way or the Lebanese approach. And, people like, hey, yeah, I mean, actually it's funny because exactly to this point in my book, I mentioned one of my trips to Beirut. I think this was 2011. It was during the Arab Spring. And I had checked into a hotel. I think it was Tulip. It was one of the sort of chain, decent hotel. It wasn't 5-star by any stretch.
I know the hotel you probably were talking about.
Okay. And so had reserved non-smoking room. Check into the hotel. Confirm at check-in. It's a non-smoking room. go up to the room, sign on the door says no smoking, open the door, go into the room, and it smells like an ashtray. I mean, it smells like people had just been smoking in there 5 minutes before I got into the room. So I called down to the front desk. I'm like, hey, I asked for a non-smoking room. He said, that is a non-smoking room. I said, okay, but clearly people have been smoking in it. He's like, this is Lebanon.
Yep.
Imagine if it was a smoking room, like the difference.
I know, but I mean, you know, his answer wasn't that, oh, this is a problem, we'll deal with it. He's like, I'm not going to move you to another room because they're all like that because this is Lebanon.
Yeah.
That, you know, and so that to your point, Baco, that was just, you know, and you know, it's funny on one level, but obviously when you add up lots and lots of people ignoring lots and lots of rules and you know, saying I'm not going to pay attention to that, it adds up to a tough situation.
Yeah. Sean, since we're on the topic of Lebanon, I kind of wanted to see maybe if you could define Hezbollah from your perspective, what your understanding is, because I've done my research on Hezbollah. I've done what's it called? My whole dissertation was about the identity of Hezbollah and the multiple identities actually that they have.
Yeah.
And I would like to see your perspective and maybe your definition of Hezbollah.
It's an interesting question. I don't know if I've ever thought of it in terms of putting it down to a definition, but certainly from my experience and talking to people across Lebanon, including I've interviewed some Hezbollah members in the past. You know, it is one of those things that it isn't just a singular thing. It isn't simply a, you know, Shia religious movement. It isn't simply a political movement or party within Lebanon. It isn't simply a, you know, military guerrilla entity that is fighting Israel. I mean, it is elements of all of those, and to some people who are either members or supporters, they have different motivations for why they support Hezbollah. I mean, obviously, you know, there are certainly many who are in line, you know, religiously believe the doctrine and follow and support that. So that, you know, there's some degree of strong religious drive to membership and support. But what was interesting to me is how many people I've met across Lebanon who religiously want nothing to do with Hezbollah, but support it because of its resistance to Israel in particular. I write about actually again in sitting in a bar, Cayenne in Ashrafia area. I don't even know if it still exists, but it was one of the favorite bars for expats. But there was a young bartender there I had a long conversation with, and he described himself as sort of a secular Shia who was not at all supportive of some of the, you know, the strict religious interpretation by Hezbollah, but he basically supported them because of their position regarding Israel. And so, you know, he would ignore lots of other things because they served an interest that he shared in. I remember I was in Cairo, and this was also, I think, 2011. And I went to the office of a woman who was the head of an NGO. She was an Egyptian woman running an organization in Cairo that did, you know, civil society, human rights work, but basically kind of a progressive organization. And while I was sitting in her office, I noticed behind her desk, she had a photo of Nasrallah. And I was stunned. She had left before I could ask her about it, but one of her colleagues was in the office and we were chatting, and I said, "Hey, I'm curious about that. There's a photo of Hassan Nasrallah in the office of a woman who is the head of a civil society organization promoting rights and women's rights and things like that. I'm like, how does this work? And he basically said, it's like, look, yeah, she doesn't agree with most of his politics, but she agrees with his position regarding Israel.
Wow.
I can completely relate to that story as well. I'll finish first. Sorry.
Yeah. And so, so those are the kinds of things that I've seen across the region. And that cause really does unite a lot of people. And the other two things I'll note that I saw, I have a friend, so he was, I can't remember whether he's Maronite, but one of the Christian sects. And it's fascinating. We were driving around the hills above Beirut, and driving along through the villages. I think it was Darun. I'm trying to remember now. And he's pointing out, the different churches. He's like, okay, that's the Armenian church over there. That's the Malachite church and all this. And so all the different Christian sects up there. And he was saying how he had, he had been a long time, Christian person in Lebanon, but was aligned with Hezbollah. And I'm trying to remember now, is it Amal? Which was the Christian party that kind of aligned with which one? Okay, yeah. Michael Allen. And he said, it was, a lot of people were very uncomfortable with that initially, but they saw a certain amount of common cause. And so they said, okay, we can deal with, as he said, it's like this big scary monster was the way he described Hezbollah, but he's like, we agree on enough things. And so again, it was what people choose as sort of their defining interests in Lebanon at any given moment. And obviously the last thing I'll just say about Hezbollah is one of the things that they've done, and they've been kind of a model for ISIS and some other groups, is their civil society work. Right. I mean, the services that they provide that the government doesn't. Another reason to keep the government divided and weak, so that you can be a service provider and build support that way. So people in a neighborhood, they see a water truck come in, and it's Hezbollah, and they say, oh, they're actually showing up for the people. Where's the government? And so that was, again, another explanation for a lot of the reason why they've been able to build the support that they've had, is that they show up and provide services that the other parties or the government as a whole doesn't do.
Yeah, 100%. And
I'm sorry, Said. What were you saying?
No, go for it. Go for it.
And the way I see it, like I live in Lebanon, so and I'm really good friends with people from Hezbollah and soldiers that are in Hezbollah. Mm-hmm. And I see Hezbollah just like any other entity as a business. I don't see them as a political faction. I don't, because everyone is motivated through a certain mean. The only reason they were created is there was an issue in Iran, and then in '79 with the U.S., and then it moved on from there. And they might say they're against Israel, but the way I see it is just like everyone else is against Israel or Israel. Words are just meaningful. The only what have they done for Lebanon against Israel other than protect themselves? Because the war in 2006 was mostly in the south, and I don't blame them. What they did was amazing, but after that, in reality, they should protect themselves. Like the government should protect itself, but they're part of the problem, not part of the solution.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Not just part of the problem; they're a symptom, right? Back to what we were talking about, of having this political structure and people looking for ways to have power, or to, if you only get a certain number of seats in parliament or cabinet members, you can't win more power through a traditional election like you can in other places. So everyone's looking at, well, how do we work outside the system? And they have figured out ways to work outside the system, really far better than many other. But I do agree with the point that you just made. I mean, they certainly aren't looking out for the country as a whole or for all the people. And they are an entity, and people equate them to a mafia or any number of other kinds of things that they're looking out for their power and their influence at the end of the day, and also serving serving Iran and to a degree Syria and those interests in the region.
Yeah. Sean, I want to pivot it a bit. I want to ask you about, do you see a future where there is no war? Is that possible?
Based on, unfortunately, my time, 7-8 years of running around places ranging from, Lebanon to the Congo, Libya, Iraq, Afghanistan, you name it. It's pretty hard to see. It's pretty hard to see human beings getting to a place where they're not competitive and not looking for, when you break it down to its most basic elements, right? I mean, you see some of the places that have been in the Eastern Congo. I mean, people are literally fighting for survival in places. In Yemen or other places, they have, they don't have a lot of access to resources. And so people will do extreme things to protect their family, to get access to food, to get access to shelter. And, things are limited resources. And frankly, you have population that's continued to grow. And so you have more people competing for a limited number of resources. And so I'd hate to be negative and pessimistic, but, I think getting to a place where there's no war, no, I don't see any likelihood of that. Can we get to a place where there's less? Again, I'm not sure. I think it is tough because there are a mix of things. I've seen people that just do horrible things out of a survival instinct, and I've also seen a lot of people who do horrible things because they like it. Some of the people in some countries that I've been really enjoy torturing other human beings. And I mean, I've seen people kind of light up when they talk about some of the atrocities that have gone on or torture of people. Sorry?
As if there's, I'm sorry for cutting you off, but as if they're showing it off. Like they're showing off that they're doing what they're doing.
Yeah. So, I don't know what percentage of human beings are, sort of evil sociopaths. There's some percentage of it. There's some number of people out there who are just cruel human beings who thrive on causing pain or just doing whatever they feel. That's not most people, but unfortunately there are enough of them, and they have enough access to weapons and power and resources and things like that they can cause a lot of trouble in a lot of places. So, I think it's tough. One of the things that I've said to a lot of people in my travels, when I visit, again, whether it's say, Lebanon or Afghanistan or Yemen, the United States has plenty of bad people who want to do bad things. There's lots of corruption here. There's lots of crime. And the reality is the United States has really strong institutions that are able to contain and push back and create a disincentive for a lot of people. So that, there's enough fear in the United States of getting caught and paying a high price for something that a lot of people who might say, I'm going to go steal that car, they decide it's too much of a risk. So I always say, Americans aren't necessarily better than people anywhere else in the world. Let's not pretend that at all. But American institutions to this point have been stronger, consistent enough You know, again, obviously here, you know, everyone talks about, you know, money talks, rich people don't face justice the way others do. And there are lots and lots of problems, but still strong enough compared to lots of other places in the world. Whereas, you know, as we start out talking about, you saying people in Lebanon that, you know, they don't fear consequences of ignoring the law.
Yep.
And so if that's the way people feel, they're going to act accordingly. And I think that's, you know, that's part of the challenge in so many places, is building governance and institutions and civic culture and things like that that respects rule of law and authority, and that people are willing to submit to a government and think it's legitimate enough to say, all right, I'll follow their rules, as opposed to thinking these are a bunch of corrupt thugs. Why should I respect anything that they say? So,
yep. Sean, on that point, whenever I talk to expats, there's always this thing that they like to say, that they feel safer when they walk on the streets back home at night than, for example, in the Western countries. So whenever I talk to Lebanese expats, they say they feel safer walking on the streets of Lebanon, even though there's less police enforcement than, for example, in London or in some cities in the US. So since we're talking about like institutions and, you know, enforcement of the law, what would you comment on that point?
I mean, I agree that I hear that a lot as well, and I have said some similar things. And you know, it is interesting when I think about that, because I do mention, I'm trying to think that, you know, at some point in my book, I mentioned something about how, you know, my family was worried about me going to places like Iraq and all that. And I joked and I said, I'm probably more likely to get shot in DC. And I mean, there is kind of a lot of truth to that. I mean, DC does have a lot of violent crime. I actually, just over a year ago, was assaulted 50 feet outside my apartment in DC.
Wow.
Oh,
yeah. And you're a cautious guy, right? You've been
well,
all over the world, you know what to look for. You know, it's like.
Well, you know, it's one of those circumstances where I was walking home and I saw some kids about to break into a car. And it was one of those moments where it's like, okay, I could turn and walk away and ignore it and let it happen. But I'm just so, you know, it was one of those moments I was just so frustrated because I see broken glass in my neighborhood all the time from cars being broken into. And so I just, without really thinking about it, I yelled at them, like, get out. I'm like, just go. And originally I only saw like 3 guys, and they look, you know, they look like teenagers. All of a sudden, there were like 7 or 8 guys standing around me on the sidewalk, and
oh my god!
So I'm you know, I started initially trying to bluster them down, and you know, like older guy again, they're teenagers. I'm like, just go, just get out, just walk away. And most of them looked like they were about to, but there was one kid in the group who, you know, as you know, it's that the one who decides, hey, I got my buddies around me, I'm gonna, you know. So he started agitating, started getting in my face, started trying to grab my wallet, took a swing at me. And so at that point, I'm like, okay, I'm right around the corner from my place. We've got surveillance cameras on the outside. So if I get around the corner and they come after me, everything's going to be captured at least. So I did. So I bolted and tried to get to my building, and like the alleyway was paved with bricks. And so I stumbled, guys got on top of me. They're hitting me, kicking me, trying to grab my wallet. Ended up sort of pushing them off. And a bunch of them were wearing like face coverings. And so one guy just went, I ripped his off, and I yelled, I said, "You're on camera," and started trying to grab another guy's face covering, and then they scattered. But yeah, I actually wrote, I have a Substack site that I wrote about it last year after it happened. And I was saying, it's like, of all the places I've been in the world, I lived in Afghanistan for 2.5 years. I've been to all the places that everyone kind of has this image of as dangerous and, you know, all that. I'm like, the only place I've ever been assaulted is 50 feet from where I live in DC.
Wow.
But to come back to your original question, I do think that, there is some degree of expat privilege that exists. And so I think, we do sometimes feel safer in other places because it's like, okay, it's riskier for someone to attack a Westerner in some places than a local. So, you do sometimes think that you're a little safer. I can't think of any time like walking around Beirut that I ever like felt unsafe. I was there in 07, 08, 10, 11, 12, 14, all those years. Never had an incident where I felt really, uncomfortable or that I had to, really watch myself. I used to walk around Kabul at night in my neighborhood, not too far, but there was, it was one of those things where it's like there were a couple of restaurants or clubs or friends' houses that were within like a 6-block radius. And for me, I just felt like I didn't want to have a driver take me 2 blocks just, for the safety of it. So I'm like, okay, I'll walk. I'd walk through an alley to go out to this one place that had music and actually jam sessions where I used to play. So sometimes I'd be carrying an electric guitar through alleyways in Kabul. And I would carry like a tactical flashlight because I just felt like if anyone approached me, I'd just sort of, blind them and run. But never encountered anything, never had a problem. I mean, I was lucky because there were people kidnapped in my neighborhood when I lived in Kabul. So, you couldn't be too reckless, but yeah, to the point, I mean, I've definitely felt more unsafe walking around some U.S. urban areas at night than a lot of other places where I spent time.
Saeed, can I ask you? Very simple. No, because if that stuff what Sean said about what happened to him
Of course,
happened
go
in
for it,
Lebanon,
Bob.
why
We have a
people
guest,
feel
but yeah, you
safer.
can
Your
go.
No, please,
experts, your
I'm
experts
curious
that
too.
Lebanese are safer in Lebanon than they are. Let's say that happened to you and you're my friend. I made sure those 7 people don't make it at home. And that
Yep.
goes to you, I mean, that goes to Sean as well.
Yep.
And where in my village, for instance, those 7 people wouldn't have made it home.
Thank you,
Yeah.
Paco.
See,
I'm happy that
we
you have my
don't
back.
like
Um,
me personally. If you
I got my 7 as well.
Yeah.
it's
No,
true.
I mean, it's a really important point because
Oh,
there
yeah,
is a lot
and
of
yeah.
self-policing that goes on in other places and other communities. I mean, I remember I spent some time in Belfast in Northern Ireland. I was there doing a story. That story is interesting. It was about how they had used torture during the Troubles and had concluded that torture was ineffective, that they never really got any useful information, and it just made things worse because it deepened animosities and all that. But they said back in the day, there was no crime. There were bombings,
Right.
but there was no street crime because people in every group enforced that. And so if some young kid in a militia group robbed someone or stole a car, they'd get
Yep.
shot in the knee by the head of their group.
Mm-hmm.
And so they said that, they really enforced those codes. It's like, look, we are a political militia. We have an interest, whichever side it was on, about, unifying Ireland or maintaining, ties with Britain. But they're like, we're not going to tolerate any, ridiculous crime and stupid behavior within our community. And we're going to police it internally, and we're not going to deal with the police. So yeah, certainly a lot of places where communities will enforce that kind of thing. And then, yeah, as you said, there's a lot of vigilante justice in a lot of places. And that does make a difference. And I think, again, it's much more complicated discussion in DC about the fact that, especially
the record
with
isn't upholding until they're
juveniles,
18.
who
the
commit
problem.
crime, and the fact that the DC system does not handle it well. So again, there isn't a sense of deterrence, and 17-year-olds in DC kind of feel like, hey, I can get away with stuff, so I'm gonna. Yeah.
They can do stuff when they're young. Yeah, Sean, when I was younger, I used to think that the UN or some kind of world police would be able to manage everything around the world. But now I'm realizing that really is like small communities that help keep everything in balance. When it comes to justice.
Hell no.
Would you agree with that, Paco?
UN is a state word.
What do you think, Sean?
Well, I mean, you're actually raising something that's broader than that. Is the notion of like conflict resolution, for example, right? I mean, so yeah, people look at top down, high level, coming into a place and trying to stop a conflict and resolve political differences and things like that. And so, the UN has this whole norm called the responsibility to protect. Right. If they see like a potential genocide about to happen, the UN has this responsibility to intervene before something happens. But what I've found and through talking to a lot of NGOs in my time, working in the U.S. government, is people found is, community-based programs are what work, because you're dealing with people at a local level, you're addressing local concerns. What the UN thinks is an issue in some village in, Chad, isn't necessarily the dynamic that's going on there, and it's not necessarily the dynamic that's going on 3 villages over. And so really looking at community dynamics, right, and figuring out, okay, what's going on here? Is this really like a religious dispute in this community, or is it some old family grievance over a piece of land, for example? Or, is it access to water or something like that? And so figuring out, is this something that's a local thing, or is this something that really is part of a broader, countrywide political, religious kind of disagreement? It's like how in Afghanistan, I mean, you'd go into a village and people in the village would come out and greet the army, for example. If I was on an embed and you go into a village and people are like, oh, hey, we're glad to see you. And people in the army say, this village is great. They like us. They support the Afghan government. If you go over the other side of this hill, it's a completely different fight. It's a different dynamic, and what works in this village doesn't work in that village. And it just sort of, highlights how difficult it is to deal with conflict or problems on a large scale, because the solution might be somewhat different in each village, and some things look like they're adding up to something bigger, but there are actually a bunch of different localized things that then you get some charismatic leader of some movement who then sort of capitalizes on that and starts a campaign of saying, oh, we all have the same grievance. Follow me and I'll fight for your needs. So, that's, but I do think, finding local dynamics and local programs is what tends to work. It's hard because everyone wants to find a big solution that you drop one basket of stuff on a place and everything's fixed. And it's like, no, it doesn't happen that way.
I'm not gonna lie, Sean, when you described the political militia that in Belfast, they kind of sounded like a cult of some sort. I don't know if you'd agree on that, or
well, I mean, I'm not enough of an expert to say what is the exact, literal definition of cult versus, militia. I think there's probably a ton. If you did a Venn diagram, right, there's a lot of overlap. I mean, they both often have very strong belief structures. Often, again, have sort of charismatic leaders who are stoking those beliefs. And yeah, I mean, look, there's if you look at militias, I mean, they have all kinds of motivations. Some of it's just pure economic sort of criminality. Some of it is political. Some's religious. Some's racial, ethnic, tribal. I mean, any number of reasons that people band together in a militia. And yeah, I would say there probably are huge similarities to how a cult is described and formed. Again, I would look at a social scientist to exactly put the terminology around it, but I think your reaction seems reasonable to me.
And yeah, I would also add that I think a lot of war has to do with information too, and what people perceive and what they're taught to perceive, and it's kind of brainwashing. You brainwash this person to hate this person, and you brainwash the other team to hate them, and then they're fighting, but you don't really know what the truth is behind the war behind it too. It's a lot of human psychology, and I find this it's really hard to know what the truth is nowadays too. I'm trying to, every time I hear
Going
something,
to a country, I think they look at the
happening
data
in Lebanon,
first,
some
then they
world
move
news,
into it.
I hear the American news, and then I have to go verify with Paco to know actually what's going on, because they're completely different. It's
You understand?
Different.
And like, for instance, like Lebanon, we don't have reliable data, and we have old data. And in Afghanistan, so like you can get one thing. I'm sorry, continue. I'm sorry for cutting you off. No, I'm just saying. No, I think. No, I think the it's all based on data. Like, for instance, the UN, when it wants to ban, is very similar. They have old data. They don't have relevant data, and it's very biased data. Most of the data
finish your
that
thought.
is collected is very incorrect, or not incorrect, very shady. Because it could mean one thing, but it really means like something else.
Inaccurate, yeah, totally.
Well, and that, I mean, look, we're getting into some really real challenges, and especially in the current environment, right? I mean, information operations is becoming an increasingly significant domain of warfare, right? I mean, if you look at the messaging that Vladimir Putin had been putting out in the run up to his invasion of Ukraine, I mean, he was basically trying to convince his own domestic audience that Ukraine is basically a separatist region of they're Russians, they're part of Russia, they're historically part of Russia, and there's this Nazi movement inside Ukraine that is threatening us and threatening our security, and we have to go in and purge these Nazis and bring our brothers back into the fold. I mean, this whole historic narrative that he was spinning out, and grievances, and sort of this Christian nationalist imagery and all sorts of things that he's throwing out there. And so the Russian audience, obviously they're captive to a certain universe of information sources. So a lot of people are not in a position to go out and fact check everything that Vladimir Putin says. And so, control over information, control over media, taking data and categorizing it a certain way to support your argument. I mean, this is enormous, and this is what's increasingly challenging. You look at, China's narrative as well around its efforts to capture island chains in the South China Sea, and some of their explanation of historic claims to pieces of island chains and things like that. I mean, everyone is trying to craft the narrative that supports their cause, and they have more and more ways to do that I mean, social media, and then, creating quote, independent media outlets. I mean, both. I mean, how many newspapers are there in Lebanon today?
So
I mean,
many.
every political party has a media outlet. It was same, in Afghanistan. I mean, every warlord, every political party group. I mean, everyone was putting out media, and because you can bypass. I mean, in the old days when you had a newspaper that had to be delivered for someone to read it and get information, or they had to turn on their television at 6 o'clock at night to watch, one of 3 nightly news broadcasts in the United States. That's how you got information. And now, it's wide open. And so this is something that I saw a lot actually when I was working for the Defense Department Inspector General's office, and we're looking at counter ISIS messaging in Iraq and Syria. And, you have groups like that. ISIS, they don't need facts, right? They don't need data. They don't need anything. They make stuff up. They can say ISIS operatives just launched an attack on American forces in this remote part of Syria and killed 50 of them. And they'll put out something like that. None of it's true.
Wow.
But it doesn't matter, because they're getting something out and they're making it seem like, oh, well, ISIS is really a powerful group. And then the United States, because, it has to be a factual response, right? The Army will sit there and someone will draft up a response, and then it gets reviewed by 5 different people, gets sent back for comment, editing. Like 2 days later, a statement comes out that says, this didn't happen. But at that point, ISIS has had 2 days of messaging. And so it's just, one kind of example, but the Taliban did this all the time. And when I was in Afghanistan, every time there was an attack, you'd get within minutes a statement from the Taliban stating, Taliban attacked an Afghan military convoy in whatever province and killed, 10 times more people than actually happened. And they captured vehicles, and they were able to get 10 soldiers to convert to supporting the Taliban.
Do you think they're using AI to send these messages?
Wow.
I mean, it's an interesting question now. I mean, certainly, back in 2012 to 14, when I was over there, no, I mean, that was their propaganda office that would churn this stuff out. And they, they did have it down to a science. And at this point, wouldn't surprise me if they have AI doing a lot of the messaging. But wow. Yeah, they put this stuff out, and then the United States or NATO or whatever has to go through a whole process to put out a fact-based, internally approved counter narrative. And then, so you think about that, you're dealing with this all over the world. You have groups that, have no legal requirement to tell the truth and are out just doing constant messaging and, creating AI accounts that are churning out bogus information and putting sponsored content into your feed. And so you're seeing stuff. I mean, it really is it's a bit overwhelming to think about, how do you get accurate information through all the noise? And how do you counter so much of this? It reminds me, and I'll sort of give a plug for the importance of journalism, because having human witnesses to things is obviously one of the best ways to counter disinformation or misinformation. And I ran into that in the Arab Spring in Bahrain. March of 2011, Egypt was off the hook. Libyan civil war was going on, and there weren't a lot of journalists in Bahrain. And I ended up there for about a week. And it was when things really went sideways in Bahrain, and protest movements had increased, and the government was cracking down. And so I mean, I was there. I was in the Pearl roundabout when there was an enormous clash, and security forces who were wearing, suspicious uniforms and not easily identifiable were firing tear gas and rubber bullets and other pellets at people. And things really escalated. And at one point I was at a hospital there for, I don't know, several hours, and ambulances just kept coming in, bringing people who said they were out in their village or neighborhood demonstrating, and suddenly vehicles pulled up, masked people came out, started shooting at them. And and they said, they were unarmed. Sorry.
Saha.
Yeah, got that piece of dust right in the back of the throat or something.
It's okay. Take your time.
Yeah, you're good.
You just have to practice the vocal cord clearing. It's like,
yeah, I didn't warm up properly before. I should know, because I do take improv classes, so you gotta warm up. But so yeah, so people were coming into the hospital. They said we were out protesting, we were unarmed. These mysterious security forces came in, started shooting at us, and so I saw people coming in covered head to toe in like birdshot or like salt pellet wounds or things like that. There was one young man who had been killed because he was shot at close range. He was hit in the head with a tear gas canister. So I'm in the hospital watching this stuff come in and seeing doctors losing their minds because they've never dealt with stuff like that there. You don't have a lot of shootings or things like that normally in a place like Bahrain. So doctors, 100%. Doctors are freaking out. They don't know how to deal with this. And then there started to be rumors that security forces were going to come attack hospitals. So we ended up getting out of there and back to the hotel. And so, I mean, again, I saw absolute chaos going on. And what I saw were protesters who were unarmed. Occasionally someone might pick up a stick, sometimes picking up rocks at most. But at the protests I attended, protesters did not instigate contact with security forces. But at some point in a couple of protests, there were mysterious guys off to the side that started instigating something that then let the security forces start firing on the crowd. So, that all happens. I do reporting about it. The Saudi troops come in and they clear the streets and all this. It's like 2 months later, I'm back in DC, and I get an invitation from a PR firm to attend a dinner with some Bahraini members of parliament that are in the city doing some PR stuff. So I go to this thing. I'm like, okay, you go to, we're in this nice function room in DC, and it's these 5 Bahraini MPs, some people from the PR company, and then 3 journalists, 2 of whom had never set foot in Bahrain. So we're sitting there, and interestingly, I guess no one told the delegation that any of the journalists had actually been to Bahrain. And so I didn't say anything before the dinner. But we're sitting there, and one of the guys starts talking about what was happening during the protests. And he's saying, you can't believe it. We're a peaceful country. We don't have guns. But there were protesters out on the street with guns. I mean, these armed people, they had arms from Iran, and it was just total chaos. And these protesters are attacking security forces, and they took over hospitals and were using them as basically tactical bases. And they had stolen ambulances and they were driving weapons into hospitals and using them as bases of operations to then go out and attack security forces. So this guy's going on and on telling these stories. And at the end of the dinner, I went up to him and I just kind of quietly said, it was interesting listening to you describe what was going on in the streets in Bahrain back then, because I didn't see any of that when I was there. And the guy just froze. He just absolutely froze. He had no idea that anyone had been there. I said, when I was there, I was in the roundabout that day. I was at the protest outside the palace. I was at this one. I was actually in a hospital where I saw people coming in with injuries from security forces. I didn't see any weapons in the hospital. I didn't see any military bases. I didn't see any ambulances that had been taken over to be used as tactical vehicles. Mm-hmm. The guy just, you could see him quaking, trying to figure out how to respond. And he sort of walked.
Gotcha moment as well.
It was. I didn't walk into that sort of knowing really what was going to happen at the dinner. I'm like, okay, I'm curious what this, what this dinner's about. And it's, I called him out on all of it, and he tried to kind of backpedal, and he's like, "Oh, well, I heard these things were going on," and I wrote about. So after that, I went home and I just sat at home for a while processing that and thinking about how often do people come through DC on delegations like that to speak to members of Congress, to speak to the State Department, to speak to whatever administration, and say, here's what's going on in my country. In their case, they're saying Iran is supporting this armed protest movement that's trying to destabilize the government. Oh, and by the way, your Fifth Fleet, your Navy is based in our country. So you really want to make sure that, these protesters don't destabilize things. And so I just thought about how often that happens, that people come through and present information that there's no one in the room who was a witness who can say, sir, actually, that's not what happened. So again, that's why you need witnesses out there. And that's why civilian journalists have become such an important thing, because people are there shooting video real time and capturing the atrocities of the Assad regime in Syria or whatever it might be. But yeah, you need witnesses to have facts that can be verified. No, look, everyone has a narrative that they need to sell their interests. There's no question. It goes on everywhere. In Afghanistan, you'd hear people in, Afghan police commanders in an area that actually was secure. And they'd be saying, oh, no, it's not that secure. We need more weapons and money and things like that. Or actually, if you leave this neighborhood, then the Taliban's going to come in. And, you see these things go on all over the place where people are trying to say, no, look, this bad group is more dangerous than you think. We need more support. Right. So there is an interest in a lot of places in the world sometimes of making things seem worse than they are in order to maintain your support. And yeah, you look at the situation in Yemen. Obviously Iran did become heavily involved in that, but that was not an Iranian organized situation in 2011. There were local issues. There were groups in Yemen that had historically fought. There was a long civil war in the country. And when things broke down, yes, then Iran is going to look at it and go, oh, well, here's an opportunity to get involved in something and, make it worse and further our interests and make things more difficult for Saudi Arabia. But, the notion that Iran was running around instigating certain things, I don't think was true. But like anything, when they see an opportunity and they're like, oh, these two groups are fighting with each other, if I support one, that helps my interests. So yeah, I'm gonna get involved now. So all across the region, and back to Lebanon, everyone ends up for years exporting their fights into Lebanon, right? I mean, Syria controlled Lebanon for so long. So like, well, we don't want instability in Syria. Let's have it next door. And we'll fight Israel not on Syrian territory, but on Lebanese territory.
A proxy war.
Yeah.
Exactly. The truth is so hard to come by. Like, it's so hard to know the true reasons behind everything. I appreciate you, Sean, and your honesty in your book and really trying to discover the truth and share it with us. Yeah.
Thanks.
Appreciate you for your time, Sean, today. We're kind of wrapping up on time now, but where can people find out more about you and your work?
Sure. So I've got 2 sites. So passport-stamps.com is the site for my book, and so there are links on that to order it through Amazon or Barnes and Noble or other places. And then I have a Substack site called passportstamps.net, and that's where I do a lot of foreign policy writing. But also, when I wrote my book, I had so much material that I couldn't put it all in the book. So I've been taking a lot of that material and put it out on Substack. So I'll write something, if something happens in Lebanon, I might write a little bit about the current news and then say, and here's a piece from, a first draft of the book about this trip to Lebanon that, I couldn't fit in the book. So kind of mixing together, my on the ground experiences in places with what's happening today. And unfortunately, a lot of the places that I visited years ago are still in the news today for unhappy reasons. Right. But again, thank you all very much. Really appreciate this. And actually, I really enjoyed the deep dive on some of this stuff. So, my policy wonk brain really enjoyed this conversation.
Perfect. Yeah, it was really interesting analysis on all these different topics. Well, thank you so much, Paco, Saeed. Good to see you, Sean Carberry. There's been another podcast of A2 The Show.
Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe on A2 The Show.
Wee.